World of Warcraft, Tides of Darkness. Written by Rosenberg. First Prologue. Fog still shrouded the world. In the sleepy village of Southshore, people stared, unable to see the dawn light, but knowing night had ended nonetheless. The fog covered the world, draping itself over their simple wooden homes and concealing the sea they knew lay just beyond the town's edge. Though they could not see it, they could hear the water lapping at the shore, rippling up around the single dock. Then they began to hear something else. Slow and steady it came, floating through the fog, the sound reverberating until they could identify neither source nor direction. Did it come from the land behind them or the sea before them? Was it merely the waves striking harder than usual, or rain beating down upon the fog itself, or some trader's wagon rolling along the hard dirt path? Listening intently, the villagers finally realized the strange new sound came from the water. Rushing to the shore, they peered out into the fog, trying to pierce its gloom. What was this noise, and what did it bring with it? Slowly the fog began to shift, as if pushed forward by the noise itself. The fog swelled and darkened, and then the darkness took on form, a wave rushing towards them. The villagers backed away, several of them crying out. They were masters of water, these men, fishermen born and bred. But this wave was not water. It moved wrong for that. It was something else. The darkness continued its approach, carrying the fog with it, the sound intensifying. Then finally it breached the fog, piercing its veil, and the shape divided into many and took on form. Boats. Many, many boats. The villagers relaxed slightly. For boats they understood, yet still they were wary. Southshore was a quiet fishing village. They had a dozen small boats themselves, no more, and had seen perhaps a dozen others through the years. Suddenly, there were hundreds approaching them all at once. What did this mean? The men grasped shortened wood clubs, knives, hooked poles, even weighted nets, whatever came to hand. And they waited tensely, watching as the boats drew closer. More boats were emerging from the mist. An unending procession, and with each new row of ships the villagers' shock grew, for there were not hundreds, but thousands approaching them, a veritable nation. More boats than they had ever seen before. Where had so many vessels come from? What could make them put to the water at once like this? And what could send them to Lordaeron? The villagers gripped their weapons more tightly, children and women hiding within their homes, and still the boats multiplied. The sounds were finally clear, as the stroke of many oars striking the water out of rhythm. The first boat beached itself, and only now could the villagers see the figures within it. They relaxed further, though their confusion and concern grew. There were men there, and women, and even children judging by their size, with skin both pale and tanned, and hair all the normal shades. These were not monsters, nor the other races the villagers had heard of, but never seen. Nor did they seem armed for battle, for clearly most of these newcomers were not warriors. This was no invasion, at least. It seemed more a flight from some horrible disaster, and the villagers felt their fear turning to sympathy. What could have sent what seemed an entire nation into the sea? More boats reached the shore, and people began to stagger out of them. Some collapsed on the rocky beach, crying. Others stood tall and took deep breaths, as if glad to be rid of the water. The fog was rolling back now, the morning sun beating it to thin wisps that faded before the strong rays. The villagers could see more clearly. These people were no army. Many of them were women and children indeed, and many were poorly dressed. Most looked thin and weak. They were just people. People clearly stricken by some calamity, many of them so overwrought they could barely stand or stumble up the shore. A few wore armor, however. One from the lead boat walked toward the assembled villagers. He was a large, stout man, almost bald, with a thick mustache and a beard and a strong, stern face. His armor had clearly seen many battles, and above one shoulder rose the hilt of a massive sword. But in his arms he carried not weapons, but 2 small children, and several more hurried alongside him, clinging to the warrior's armor, belt, and scabbard. Beside him walked a strange man, tall and broad-shouldered, but slender, white-haired, but with a strong stride. This one was dressed all in tattered violet robes and a worn rucksack, and carried a child across one shoulder while leading another by the hand. A third figure moved with them, a youth, brown-haired and brown-eyed, and barely aware of his surroundings. One hand holding the large man's cloak, like a small child clinging desperately to a parent's hand. His clothes were richly made, but stiff with sea salt and worn from hard use.
"Hail and well met,"
the warrior called out, approaching the villagers, his broad face grim.
"We are refugees fleeing a terrible, terrible battle. I beg you, any food and drink you might spare, and shelter if you can, for the children's sake."
The villagers glanced at one another, then nodded, weapons lowering. They were not a wealthy village, but they were not poor either, and they would have to be far worse off to let children go unaided. Men came and took the children from the warrior and the violet-robed one, and led them to the church, their largest, sturdiest structure. Already the village women were stirring up pots of porridge and stew. Soon the refugees were camped in the church and around it, eating and drinking, sharing donated blankets and coats. The mood would have been festive, if not for the sorrow evident in every newcomer's face.
"Thank you,"
the warrior told the village headman, who had introduced himself as Marcus Redpath.
"I know that you cannot spare much, and I am grateful for what you have given us."
"We will not let women and children suffer," Marcus replied. He frowned, studying the other man's armor and sword. "Now tell me, who are you, and why are you here?"
"My name is Anduin Lothar,"
the warrior answered, running a hand over his forehead.
I was, the Knight Champion of Stormwind."
"Stormwind?" Marcus has heard of the nation. "But that is across the sea."
"Yes,"
Lothar nodded sadly.
"We sailed for days to reach this land. We are in Lordaeron, are we not?"
"We are?" the violet-robed one commented, speaking for the first time. "I recognize the land, though not this village." His voice was surprisingly strong for an old one, though up close, only his hair and the lines on his face suggested advanced age. Otherwise, he'd seemed barely more than a youth. "This is Southshore," Marcus told them, eyeing the white-bearded young man warily. "You are from Delaron?" he asked at last, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Aye," the stranger acknowledged. "And do not fear, I will be returning there as soon as my companions can travel." Marcus tried not to let his relief show. The wizards of Delaron were powerful, and he had heard the king treated them as allies and advisors. But for himself, Marcus wanted no truck with magic or its wielders.
"We must not delay,"
Lothar was agreeing.
"I must speak with the king at once. We dare not give the horde time to move again."
Marcus did not understand this comment, but he recognized the urgency in the stocky warrior's tone. "The women and children may stay here a time," he assured them. "We will care for them."
"Thank you,"
Lothar said with obvious sincerity.
"We will send food and other supplies back once we reach the king."
"It will take you time to reach the capital city," Marcus pointed out. "I will send someone ahead on a fast horse to warn them of your approach. What will you have them say?" Lothar frowned.
"Tell the king that Stormwind has fallen,"
he said softly after a moment's pause.
"The prince is here, as are as many of its people as I could save. We will need supplies, and quickly, and we bring him grave and urgent news."
Marcus's eyes had widened at the list of troubles, and his gaze had gone quickly to the youth standing beside the big warrior, then moved away before his stare could become rude. "It will be done," he assured them, and turned away to speak to one of the villagers, who nodded and leaped onto a nearby horse, galloping away before the headman had taken 2 steps back to the church. "William is our finest rider, and his horse the fastest in the village," Marcus assured the 2 men. "He will reach Capital City well ahead of you and deliver your message. We will gather horses and what food we can for you and your companions to take on your own journey." Lothar nodded.
"Thank you."
He turned to the violet-robed man.
"Gather those who would come with us, Khadgar, and make ready. We leave as soon as possible."
The wizard nodded and turned away, heading for the nearest cluster of refugees. A few short hours later, Lothar and Khadgar left Southshore, the Prince Varian Wern beside them, leading 60 men. Most had chosen to remain behind, either from illness or fatigue, or simply out of fear and shock and a desire to cling to those few survivors from their own land. Lothar did not begrudge them. A part of him wished he could have remained in the small fishing village as well, but he had a duty to perform, as always.
How far to Capital City?
He asked Khadgar, riding beside him. The villagers had offered them to use of what few mounts and carts they had, which had proven just enough to manage. Lothar had hesitated about taking any more from the generous villagers, but had finally accepted, knowing it would speed their promise immeasurably, and time was of the essence. "A few days, perhaps a week," the wizard replied. "I don't know this part of the country that well, but I remember it on the maps. We should see the city spires in 5 days at most. Then we will have to pass through Silver Pine Forest, one of the great wonders of Lordaeron, to skirt Lordaemer Lake. The city stands along its shore." Khadgar fell silent again, and Lothar studied his companion. He worried about the young man. When first they met, he'd been impressed by the wizard's composure and easy self-confidence, and astonished at his youth. He had been only 17, little more than a boy, and already a wizard in his own right, and the first Medivh had ever deigned to accept as an apprentice. Subsequent encounters had shown him that Khadgar was bright, stubborn, focused, and friendly. He found himself liking the boy, the first time that he'd had felt such friendship toward a wizard since Medivh himself. But after the events at Karazhan, Lothar shuddered, remembering the ugly, nightmarish conflict. He had found himself with Khadgar, the half-orc Garona, and a handful of men, against Medivh himself. Khadgar had administered a lethal blow to his master out of necessity, but it had been Lothar who had removed his old friend's head, a head he had protected many times in their youth, back when he and Medivh and Lane had been friends and companions. Lothar shook his head to drive away the tears. He had grieved many times on their long sea voyage, but still it felt as if the pain and rage and sorrow would overwhelm him. Lane, his best friend, his companion, his king. Lane, with the bright smile and the laughing eyes and the quick wit. Lane, who had carried Stormwind into a golden age, only to see it torn apart by the orcs, their horde sweeping across the land and destroying everything in their path, and then to discover that Medivh had been responsible for it all, that his magic had aided the orcs in reaching this world, had given them access to Stormwind, and thus had led to not only the kingdom's destruction, but Lane's death. Lothar bit back a cry at the thought of all he had lost, all his people had lost, and then he hardened himself to it, as he had so many times during their journey. He could not let himself succumb to such emotion. His people needed him, and so did the people of this land, though they did not know it yet. And so did Khadgar. Lothar still did not understand everything that had happened in Karazhan that night. Perhaps he never would. But somehow, during the battle with Medivh, Khadgar had changed. His youth had been stripped away, his body aged unnaturally. Now he appeared an old man, far older than Lothar himself, though Khadgar was the younger of them by almost 4 decades, and he worried what else it had done to the young wizard. Khadgar, for his part, was too lost in his own thoughts to notice his companion's concerned gaze. The young old wizard's thoughts were turned inward, though they ran along the same lines as his companion. He was reliving the battle in Karazhan, and experiencing again that horrible, wrenching sensation as Medivh drew from his magic and his youth. The magic had returned indeed. In many ways it was far stronger now than before, but his youth was gone, torn from him long before its time. He was an old man now, at least in appearance. He still felt hale and hearty. He had as much endurance and strength and agility as ever, but his face was lined, his eyes deep set, and his hair and fledgling beard a stark white. Though only 19, Khadgar knew he looked 3 times that and more. He looked like the man in his vision, the older version of himself he had seen in battle through the magic of Medivh's tower. The older man who would someday die beneath a strange red sun, far from home. Khadgar also studied the emotions within him, the ones that came from Medivh's death. The man had been evil incarnate, single-handedly responsible for loosing the orc horde upon the world. Yet it had not been the man, not truly, for Medivh had been subsumed by the titan Sargeras, who his mother had defeated millennia before. Sargeras had not died, only his body, and he had hidden away within Agwyn's womb, infesting her unborn son. Medivh had not been responsible for his own actions, and his dying words to Khadgar had revealed that the Magus had been fighting the evil within himself for years, perhaps all his life. Khadgar had even encountered a strange phantom version of his dead master shortly after burying the body, and that Medivh had claimed to be from the future and to be free of Sargass's taint at last, thanks to Khadgar himself. So what should he feel, Khadgar wondered? Should he be sad that his master had died? At times he had liked Medivh a great deal, and certainly the world had lost much when the Magus died. Should he be proud of the role he had played in freeing the man and driving Sargeras from this world again, perhaps for good? Should he be enraged at what Medivh had done, both to him and to others, or awed that one man could resist the influence of a Titan for so long? He could not tell. Khadgar's mind was a whirl, as was his heart, and added to all the thoughts of Medivh were more, for he was home, at least. He was back in his homeland, back in Lordaeron, and not in the way he had expected, when he had left to become Medivh's apprentice, at the behest of his previous masters in Dalaran. Khadgar had not expected to return until he was a master mage himself. He had thought to fly back on a griffin, as Medivh had taught him, and land atop the Violet Citadel, so that all his former teachers and fellows could marvel at his prowess. Instead, he was riding a plow horse beside Stormwind's former champion, leading a ragtag band of men to speak to the king about saving the world. Khadgar bit back a chuckle. Well, at least they would make a dramatic entrance, he thought. That was something his old teachers and friends would appreciate. "What will we do once we reach the city?" he asked Lothar, startling the aging warrior from some reverie. His companion recovered quickly, however, turning to study him with those disarming storm-blue eyes that showed the warrior's emotions plainly, but hid the sharp mind within.
"We will speak with the king,"
Lothar replied simply. He glanced at the youth riding silently beside them, and reached back to stroke the handle of his greatsword, its gems and gold gleaming in the afternoon sunlight.
"Though Stormwind is lost, Varian is still her prince, and I am still her champion. I have only met King Tyrannos briefly, and many years ago, but perhaps he will recognize me. Certainly he will know Varian, and the messenger will make sure he is aware of our arrival. He will grant us an audience, and then we shall tell him what has happened and what must be done."
"And what must we do?" Khadgar asked, though he thought he already knew.
"We must gather the rulers of this land,"
Lothar answered, as Khadgar had thought he might.
"We must force them to see the danger. No nation can stand alone, not against the Horde. My own land tried and is gone because of it. We must not let that happen here. The people must unite and fight."
His hands clenched on the horse's reins. Khadgar could see the powerful warrior who had led Stormwind's armies and kept its borders safe for so many years. "Let us hope they listen," Khadgar said softly, "for all our sakes."
"They will,"
Lothar assured him.
"They must."
Neither of them said what both were thinking. They had seen the power of the Horde firsthand. If the nations did not unite, if their rulers refused to see the danger, they would fall, and the Horde would sweep across this land as it had crossed Stormwind, leaving nothing behind. Second Prologue. A dark figure stood upon a tall tower, gazing out at the world below him. From his vantage point, he could see the city beneath and the countryside around it. Both were covered in swirling, shifting darkness, a tide that swept across the land and covered the buildings, leaving them in ruins. The figure watched, tall and powerfully built, massively muscled. He stood motionless upon the stone peak, his sharp eyes studying the scene below him. Long dark hair swung in braids about his chiseled face, the tasseled ends occasionally striking the long tusks that jutted up from his lower lip. The sun beat down upon him, making his skin glow emerald in the light, and creating a glare from the many trophies and medallions he wore about his neck and across his broad chest. Heavy plates covered his chest, shoulders, and legs, their scarred surfaces gleaming black, except where heavy bronze knobs studded them. Gold gleamed along the edges, proclaiming his importance. At last the figure had seen enough. He raised the enormous black warhammer he had been leaning upon, its stone head absorbing rather than reflecting the sunlight, and bellowed. It was a war cry, a summons, and an exclamation, and the sound swept forth, slamming into the buildings and hills around him and echoing back. Below him, the dark tide ceased its movement. Then it rippled, as faces turned upward. Every orc in the Horde stopped and looked, staring at the solitary figure high above. Again he shouted, his hammer held high, and this time the tide erupted in cheers and shouts and answering cries. The Horde accomplished its leader, satisfied. Ogrim Doomhammer let his signature weapon drop back down to his side, and the dark tide below resumed its destructive motion. Down below, beyond the city's gates, an orc lay upon a cot. His short, scrawny frame was covered in thick furs, a sign of high status, and rich clothing lay in a pile nearby. But the clothing had not been touched, not in weeks, for the orc lay without stirring, as if dead, his ugly face scrunched in pain or concentration, his bushy beard bristling about his snarling mouth. Then, suddenly, it all changed. With a gasp, the orc sat upright, the furs falling away from his sweat-drenched body. His eyes opened, glassy and unseeing at first, then blinking away the long sleep and glancing around him.
"Where?"
the orc demanded. A larger figure was already moving to his side, both heads registering pleased surprise. And as the orc's gaze caught him, the eyes sharpened, as did the features. Whatever confusion had lingered was gone, replaced by cunning and rage.
"Where am I?"
he demanded.
"What has happened?" "You are asleep, Gul'dan,"
the other creature replied, kneeling by the cot and offering a goblet. The orc grabbed it, sniffed it, and tossed back the contents with a grunt, wiping a hand across his mouth afterward.
"Asleep like death for weeks now. You have not moved and barely breathed. We thought your spirit gone." "Did you now?"
Gul'dan grinned.
"Were you afraid I would leave you, Cho'Gall? Abandon you to Black Hand's tender mercy?"
The two-headed ogre mage glared at him.
"Black Hand is dead, Gul'dan,"
one head snapped. The other frantically nodded agreement.
"Dead?"
At first Gul'dan thought he had misheard, but Cho'Gall's grim expressions convinced him even before both of the ogre's heads nodded.
"What? How?"
He pulled himself up to a sitting position, though the motion made him reel and break out in a cold sweat.
"What has happened while I slept?"
Cho'Gall began to answer, but his words died as someone thrust aside the tent flap and burst into the small dim space. Two burly orc warriors shoved Cho'Gall out of the way and roughly grabbed Gul'dan's arms, hauling him to his feet. The ogre began to protest, rage darkening his twinned features, but two more orcs squeezed into the tight space and barred his path, heavy battle axes at the ready. They stood guard as the first two dragged Gul'dan from the tent.
"Where are you taking me?"
he demanded, trying to wrest his arms free. It was no use, however. Even at full health, he would not have been a match for either warrior, and now he could barely hold himself upright. They were dragging him as much as leading him, and he saw that he was being taken toward a large, well-crafted tent, Black Hand's tent.
"He took control, Gul'dan,"
Cho'Gall said quietly, pacing beside him, but staying beyond the warrior's reach.
"While you were unconscious, he attacked the Shadow Council and killed most of them. Only you and I and a few of the lesser warlocks remained."
Gul'dan shook his head, trying to clear it. He still felt fuzzy, unfocused, and from what Cho'Gall said, this was not a good time to lack clarity. But what the ogre had said made him more confused rather than less. Kill Black Hand? Destroy the Shadow Council? It was insane.
"Who?"
he demanded again, twisting to face Cho'Gall over the warrior's broad shoulders.
"Who did this?"
But Cho'Gall had slowed his steps, falling back, a look of surprising fear crossing both his faces. Gul'dan turned back around just as a powerful figure strode forward, and at once, seeing the massive warrior in his black plate armor, the colossal black warhammer held so easily in his hands, Gul'dan understood. Doomhammer.
"So you are awake?"
Doomhammer all but spat the words as the warriors stopped before him. They released Gul'dan's arms suddenly, and the orc warlock was unable to stop himself from crumbling to the ground. He looked up, on his knees, and gulped at the naked fury and hatred he saw in his captor's face. Gul'dan began, but Doomhammer cut him off, backhanding him hard enough to lift him off the ground and drop him in a heap several feet away.
"Silence!"
The new horde leader snarled.
"I did not say you could speak."
He strode closer, raising Gul'dan's chin with the head of his fearsome weapon.
"I know what you have done, Gul'dan. I know you controlled Black Hand. You and your Shadow Council."
He laughed, a harsh sound filled with bitterness and disgust.
"Oh yes, I know about them, but your warlocks will not help you now. They are dead, many of them, and the few who remain are chained and watched."
He leaned closer.
"I rule the Horde now, Gul'dan. Not you, not your warlocks. Doomhammer alone. And there will be no more dishonor, no more treachery, no more deceits and lies."
Doomhammer rose to his full impressive height,
towering over Gul'dan. Durotan died from your scheming, but he will be the last, and he will be revenged. No more will you rule our people from the shadows. No more will you control our fate and direct us for your own sordid purpose. Our people will be free of you.
Gul'dan cowered, thinking fast. He had known Doomhammer could become a problem. The powerful orc warrior was too intelligent, too honorable, too noble to be easily swayed or controlled. He had been second to Blackhand, the powerful Black Rock leader Gul'dan had chosen as his puppet for the Horde leadership. Blackhand had been an extremely powerful fighter, but had thought himself clever and thus had been easily controlled. Gul'dan and his Shadow Council had been the real powers, and Gul'dan had ruled the council as easily as he did their war chief. But not Doomhammer. He had refused to follow, carving his own path with reckless abandonment, equaled only by his loyalty to their people. Clearly, he had not seen what occurred behind the scenes, witnessed what he considered corruption, and when he had finally seen enough, when he could endure no more, he had acted. Clearly, Doomhammer had chosen his moment carefully. With Gul'dan out of the way, Blackhand had been vulnerable. He had discovered the Shadow Council's location was unclear, but obviously he had done so and then had eliminated most of them, leaving Gul'dan, Cho'Gall, and who knew what others, and now he stood over Gul'dan, hammer raised, ready to destroy him as well.
Wait,
Gul'dan cried out, both hands raising automatically to shield his face and head from harm.
please, I beg you.
That made Doomhammer pause.
You, the mighty Gul'dan, beg. Very well, dog. Beg for your life.
The hammer had not lowered, but at least it had not fallen yet. Gul'dan hated him then. Hated him with a passion he had never known for anything but power itself, yet he knew what he had to do. Doomhammer hated him as well, for orchestrating his old friend Durotan's death, and for transforming their people from peaceful hunters to raving warmongers. Given even the slightest excuse, that hammer would smash his skull in, coating itself with his blood and hair and brain. He could not allow that to happen.
I bow to your might, O grim Doomhammer.
He managed at last, pronouncing each word clearly, and loud enough that all those nearby could hear him.
I acknowledge you as War Chief of the Horde, and I pledge myself to you. I will obey you in all things.
Doomhammer grunted.
You have never demonstrated obedience before,
he pointed out sharply.
Why should I believe you capable of it now? Because you need me,
Gul'dan replied, raising his head to meet the war chief's glare.
You have slain my Shadow Council, yes, and consolidated your power over the Horde. That is as it should be. Blackhand was not strong enough to lead us on his own. You are, and you have no need of a council.
He licked his lips.
But you need warlocks. You need our magic. For the humans have magic of their own, and without us, you will fall to their power.
He shook his head.
And you have very few warlocks left. Myself, Cho'Gall, and a handful of neophytes. I am too useful to kill simply for revenge.
Doomhammer's lips pulled back in a snarl, but he lowered the hammer. For a moment, he said nothing, simply glaring at Gul'dan, his gray eyes filled with hate. But finally, he nodded.
What you say is true,
he admitted, though the words clearly took enormous self-control to utter.
And I will place the need of the Horde over my own.
He bared his tusks.
I will let you live, Gul'dan. You and those of your warlocks who remain, but only as you prove useful. Oh, we will be useful,
Gul'dan assured him, bowing low. His mind was already working.
I will create for you a host of creatures such as you have never seen before, mighty Doomhammer. Warriors who will serve you alone. With their might and our magic, we will crush this world's magi, even as the Horde tramples its warriors into dust.
Doomhammer nodded, his snarl fading to a thoughtful frown.
Very well,
he said at last.
You have promised me warriors who can combat the humans' magic. I will hold you to that.
Then he turned and walked away, clearly dismissing him. The orc warrior departed as well, leaving Gul'dan still on his knees, with Cho'Gall not far away. The Orc warlock thought he heard them laughing as they left. Damn him, Gul'dan thought, watching the war chief disappear back into his tent. And damn that human wizard as well. Gul'dan shook his head. Perhaps he should be cursing his own impatience instead. It had been that which had driven him to enter Medivh's mind, seeking the information the Magus had promised. And it had merely been bad luck that Gul'dan had been inside Medivh's mind when the humans had died, his own spirit weakened by the sudden violence. He had been trapped, unable to return to his body all this time, unaware of the world around him, and that had given Doomhammer the opportunity to seize control. But now, at last, he was awake again, and once more he could pursue his plans, because at least that desperate, dangerous act not been wasted. Gul'dan had the information he needed, and soon he would not need Doomhammer or the Horde any longer. Soon he would be all-powerful without them.
Gather the others,
he told Cho'Gall, pushing himself off the ground and testing his limbs. He was weak, but he would manage. He had no time to do otherwise.
I will forge them into a clan in truth that will serve my own ends and protect me from Doomhammer's wrath. They shall be Stormweavers, and they will show all the Horde what we warlocks can accomplish, until even Doomhammer cannot deny their worth. Gather your clans as well.
Cho'Gall led the Twilight Hammer's clan. They were obsessed with the end of the world, but were fearsome fighters.
There is much to do.
End of prologue.